Chapter 316, Mentor Aberdeen City, 10 years prior. The 20-year-old Garen aimed the new plasma gun at the target, destroying it with a perfect hit. It's not bad handling a new weapon. Henry nodded, impressed, patting Garen's shoulder, in stark contrast to his sternness when he was still a new recruit. "Thank you, General," he said, and he looked around, a bit puzzled the General was here in the shooting range. "Come with me." Garen nodded and dutifully followed his superior deep into the military building. Soon, they ended up inside a meeting room over 200 square meters in size. The walls were lined with various large screens, each one showing differing live images around the country. There were even images from abroad, as well as satellite images. As a centerpiece, there was an interactive screen integrated into the large 1-meter radius table. Garen's eyebrows rose. This was the strategy room. Anyone who could come here was someone of power. "I'm bringing you here because I need you to lead a team to rescue a very important group of students." The old man showed him folders and folders of files about teenagers. "This is a school bus from Caton Academy." Caton Academy was one of the country's premier schools for the very, very privileged. It was estimated every child in that school bus had at least one parent in power. Then Henry sighed and a folder stayed on his hand, almost crumpling it. "My daughter is included here," he said, "so I was judged as unqualified to lead the team. The same goes for the 2 other people who could do the same. Parents would die for their children, as people die for their beliefs. Do you remember what I told you when I recruited you?" Garen was recruited to the military because he was noticed for his valiant rescue of 2 children. That was, Althea and Ansel. Henry happened to be monitoring the updates because he knew the wits personally. He was impressed by Garen's prowess and recruited him to enter a special program in the military. Being in this position is to protect your country, and more importantly, your loved ones. A heavy hand patted and stayed on his shoulder. "I can only depend on you for this." Fargo Village, present. The group followed Beanie to another house on the other side of the village. They saw that this place had also been devastated by a few monsters. Most walls had been demolished, and marks of blood were still fresh everywhere. Beanie said that it was the General's small team that handled the monster. "Soldiers are soldiers," he said with melancholy, "even when the country is no more." The team of level 4s and 5s tried to fight with the monsters, but it wasn't easy. Their team of 20 was reduced by a third before they finally took down the one. While they managed to deal with the other monster that plagued the area, in the end, they were left with 12. Garen's pace hastened as he listened, and Vanessa closely followed behind him. They reached a standard housing, dilapidated by the fight. Fortunately, the houses built by the system were structurally sound, as long as the Lord didn't die, of course. They did not even knock and went into the house, causing the mobile soldiers, barely bandaged by old cloth, to flinch and take on a defensive stance. One of these people was still familiar, especially to Vanessa, whose eyes quickly turned red as she ran into the man's arms. "Brother." "V. Vanessa," the dirty, bloody, but dashing man exclaimed, thinking he must have been seeing things. However, when he felt her warmth, he realized he was not dreaming. He quickly opened his arms to take her deeper into his embrace. Vincent smiled in relief as he patted his sister's back. He felt a little teary, not expecting to encounter his sister, who had been presumed dead for nearly half a year. After gathering himself, he lifted his head to look behind her. He was a bit surprised to see so many others standing there. His eyes soon met with Garen's and gave each other a mutual nod. Garen stepped forward, head pointing to the people lying on hemp mattresses on the other side of the room, covered with blood. "How are they?" It was here that the others' attention focused on the other end of the room. They were all covered in makeshift bandages, and it was difficult to determine who was who. "There are 12 of us left, but 4 of us." Then he remembered something and shook his sister. "Sis, you're a doctor, take a look at them quickly," he said, and Vanessa remembered her strong father could be one of those people. Vincent stood to the man in the middle, covered in blood, and Vanessa sobbingly kneeled down to treat him. She was a bit shaky, however. "Dad, oh no, woo." Garen saw that it would take her a while to treat his mentor, and turned to look at Turbo, who nodded back and immediately followed Vanessa's lead. Turbo took out his kit and handled the injured people as efficiently as he could, starting with the general. Vanessa saw this and finally calmed down a bit, helping him out with relative efficiency. The 4 people were in really bad shape. However, the bleeding was stopped and no internal organs were displaced, so they could still be saved. The soldiers who got fatal injuries had already long perished. This was still very impressive, however. One must know taking down monsters of the same level generally required 3 to 5 humans. They had to handle stronger monsters. Fortunately, all of them should survive with time. Seeing the wounds being handled properly, everyone's shoulders slumped in relief. While there was still plenty to fix, at least the most critical period has passed. Garen stood next to Vincent, who could be said to be an old acquaintance. "How are you?" "Fine, more or less just how we look." The brunette smiled with a shrug, but his eyes showed the tiredness and tragedy they encountered at this time. Vincent saw Garen looking at him, waiting for him to say more details, and he sighed, doing so. "We migrated together, a group of about 50 soldiers, along with a score of civilians," he said. "The mob was predominantly level 2, which could not compare to the zombies at all. We lost a third of our people, even with the guns. In fact, had it not been for the civilians, half of the sacrifices wouldn't have had to be made, but soldiers had an understanding of this and would never utter it out loud. For about a week or 2 we managed to survive in the wilderness, built our own sheds and the like." Then his expression darkened even more, his fist clenched in bitterness. "But a beast tide ran in and we could only run away, somehow in the direction the mob was going towards, to the newly upgraded Fargo village. We entered and joined the territory, relieved to finally find a safe haven of sorts. It's just that." Vincent paused, heaving a deep breath, unable to speak anymore. Garen looked at his heavy expression, and knew they must have had some conflicts with the Lord here. A slyer part of him couldn't help but think, perhaps he could get their help in dealing with this scum. "Fargo give you a hard time?" he asked, making the other man flinch a bit. Vincent didn't speak for a while, heaving a sigh. "Do you remember Paolo?" "Paolo Cruz?" Garen asked. He was in his team hunting for Fargo. He had lost his daughter in one of Fargo's attacks in a children's hospital. The little girl was just testing for a simple cough with her mother. Vincent nodded. Garen immediately knew what happened. You can imagine how insane he went when he saw Fargo strutting around like he owned the place. Which he did, we found out too late, Vincent said with a monotonous voice, but one could see how angry he was with how his jaw tightened. He was killed brutally in front of a crowd as an example. His jaw clenched and his hands formed a fist. The bastard had the audacity to display our comrade's body by the gate. Those who heard him felt their heart constrict in anger. What a bastard. What made it worse was that he was finally in front of them, yet they couldn't do anything about him. Vincent heaved a deep breath before speaking. The terror brought on the territory was very real. It was the beginning of tyranny. They killed and plundered as they wanted, and we also lost a lot of people trying to protect the citizens. Terrans were used to freedom. They naturally didn't take such brutality lying down, at least at first. Unsurprisingly, people ran to us for help, he said. It went well at first, with us forming a small force as subtly as we could. However, one day, one of our men goes missing, and the very next day a family yells at us to bring their daughter back. Our reputation fell, but a lot of people still believe in us. His men started to limit their brutalities, and started to attack our supporters. Vincent heaved a deep breath and raised his head. Letting it rest on the wall behind him, no one dared ask for help after that. It didn't help that life had indeed gotten better. People could eat and drink every day, and they were protected very well from the monsters outside, especially when the territory started hiring Aborigines. These Aborigines were much stronger than all of us combined, who would want to side with us after that. Fargo's men do take women as they want, but they don't kill them. Unless the people went against the Lord and his party, they would keep their lives. This became the status quo. It was disgusting, but we couldn't risk our lives for a hopeless fight. It was just that the next week after that, another 2 men were taken subtly for punishment, after trying to save a woman, and were never seen again. Before we could organize a rescue, he paused and looked around. This happened. The others listened in a dour mood, and Vincent rubbed his temple, not meaning to sound so emotional. But right now, I just want my father to be okay. Garen and the others sighed in worry, shifting their attention as the patients were being treated. Fortunately, both Vanessa and Turbo had become proficient in using the medicines available. Using a diluted potion they won from the mercenary mission, they managed to improve a number of wounds. Although it was diluted, it was still effective. Vincent and the others were amazed. He looked at Garen with wide eyes. "What is that medicine?" "It's a special medicine we got from a mission. It is made by a pharmacist." "What?" Vincent's eyebrows furrowed, "but I haven't seen such quick effects." It was Gil who spoke this time, an Aborigine pharmacist. He explained, "They have a certain magical skill set." Vincent and the others were a little confused. "What mission are you talking about, exactly?" "One from a mercenary hall. They're available in towns." Vincent and the other soldiers looked at them in shock, especially Vincent. It didn't really occur to them until now. Garen and the others had probably been here since they were missing. "Where is this town?" he asked. How long have you been here?" He didn't even wait for them to speak, already knowing in his heart what the answer was. His back straightened and looked at Garen, Gil, and the others. "Tell me more about this world." They stayed for about an hour before the general opened his eyes to see the daughter he never thought he'd see again. "Daughter," he exclaimed, so shocked that he ended up coughing. "Dad," she sobbed, hugging the man to keep himself from moving. "Don't get up, it'll open your wound." The man froze, feeling his daughter's warmth, and knew for certain he wasn't dreaming nor was he dead. His eyes pooled tears and Vanessa's heart broke seeing her stern father like this. "Dad!" The old man gripped her hand, though it wasn't very strong as he was still weak, but it expressed his emotions clearly. "You are fine, you are fine." "HMN, yes Dad, we are," she said, sobbing, and the father-daughter pair just held onto each other for a while before they could gather themselves. At this time, Vincent had also parted from Gil and the others to sit down next to his sister. Seeing his two children together, alive and with complete limbs, Henry couldn't help but be even more emotional. "Son, daughter." As he held his children's hands in relief, his peripheral vision finally saw the other group squeezing in their small house. He flinched and had to be held down again to keep himself from doing any abrupt movements. "Garen, is that you?" At the sound of his name, Garen stepped forward, nodding respectfully. "Yes, General." The old man smiled and looked at the people around. He then looked alternatively at Vanessa and Garen. "Did you arrive together?" "Everyone who disappeared at that time was sent here," he said, although only a score of us remained. "It's fine, as long as you're fine." The old man then looked at his daughter, who was stealing glances at the man with a red face, and his eyes brightened a little. Garen had a bad feeling and stood up. "Let's leave the family alone," he said and politely excused himself. The others from his team followed his lead and put some distance. As they walked away to give the family some space, Gil sighed, looking at the father-daughter pair. "For a moment there I thought the general would leave his daughter in your care," he told Garen as soon as they were out of earshot. Garen sneered. Even if it happened, he would only give minimum protection. He would never let anything that his wife could misunderstand close to him. Although they fully trusted each other, no one appreciated flies irking them. "Have you forgotten her brother is right there?" "Ah yeah, sorry, I watched too many of my ex's soap operas," Gil said with pursed lips, shrugging. Unfortunately, for many years, he had been dragged to watch a lot of his ex's dramas. It even became a habit until it became a stress reliever for him, even when he was in the barracks. Even his snide remarks would occasionally contain cheesy lines from famous face-slapping scenes. However, they hadn't gotten far when Vincent went after them, calling them back. "No, Garen, come back please. We have plenty of time to speak together," he said. "It's you wouldn't be staying here for long, right?" The general frowned and looked at Garen. "You wouldn't stay?" The ebony-haired man nodded. "Yes, we found the territory my wife is in. I will look for her. Of course, I will not stop anyone else from going to the territories they believe their families are in." This implied Vanessa could definitely stay here without worrying about their team. The general's eyebrows furrowed. "It is not safe here, not exactly. But they could not travel either, especially when the direction was still unclear. But we cannot leave. The Lord is too powerful in his own territory," he said, "but I feel uncomfortable leaving that beast running around doing what they wanted." "Yes, my conscience will kill me eventually," another soldier nodded in agreement. "But what can we do?" he said. "He definitely won't go out with us." They assumed that getting the Lord outside would diminish his power. It would, of course, however, they hadn't considered something very important. You can't kill the Lord outside of the wars, Garen intervened. The entire territory would disintegrate. What and wars? Garen was silent before looking deeply at Vincent and the general. He could tell they truly hated Fargo. However, there is another way. His eyes sharpened and he stared at the other two men, eyes stern and tempting. What if I told you there's a way to take the token away from him? Garen and Gil did not leave the general's house until late at night, after a long while of discussing strategies. As for whether Fargo was watching their movements, they couldn't do anything about that. They could only prepare to be attacked. There was no way. A lord was simply too powerful within his own territory. Lords can really see loyalty. Wouldn't we be discovered soon? Gil shook his head. No, the minimum is 0, never negative. 0 isn't conclusive evidence of betrayal. I'm sure a lot of people here have this number. Vincent and the others heaved a sigh of relief. Their values were definitely zeros, but they were sure that at least a third of the territory was the same. Soon, the group started to discuss the timing of their attacks. After all, because there was no war yet, they couldn't deal with Fargo or else the territory would disintegrate. They also could attack during the territory wars, in which case that was just damaging to oneself. We can't risk anyone else, the general said. Henry was a very upright old man. It was just that he married a snobbish socialite and spoiled his only daughter. Of course, Garen said, we can only bide our time, strengthen ourselves. In the end, they decided to subtly strengthen their force here, in which case, a few of their team will stay. But not too many, as that would raise Ammon's vigilance. Before adjourning, Garen looked at his small team. At least 2 people will remain. Your task will be to help raise the level of others, he said, looking at his soldiers and telling them of their mission. Raise their levels to a point Fargo wouldn't be able to do anything to them. Yes, Captain. Similarly, they would be able to safeguard themselves during the imminent territory war, whenever that could be. The problem was if Ammon noticed their level increase and made an issue out of it. And also, Fargo already had strong aborigines with him, right? That is troublesome. Isn't there a way to hide levels from the omniscient eyes of a territory lord? They asked Gories, who they let join. Anyway, slaves were contract-bound never to betray their masters. Similar to how hired individuals could not utter anything sensitive related to the hiring territories. At this, Gories looked down, very guilty. I apologize, but I have not heard of such. Silence reigned in the room again, and some were even wondering if it was really safe to stay here. However, they would be reminded of all the people who would have to suffer under the man's reign, and their consciences attacked them again. At the very least, with them here, Fargo and their forces would control the intensity of their killings. If they were gone, maybe Fargo's men wouldn't care anymore, because there would be no one the people could turn to anymore if things got bad enough to risk their lives. Just lay low, Garen said after a while. Perhaps he would be too busy dealing with other enemies now that the protection period is over. Garen's group prepared to leave first thing the next day. Among Garen's team, only Vanessa and 2 others, Leo and Santos, remained with the general. O and Giant also belatedly decided to stay. Obviously, it was because he was still bitter with the captain and didn't want to have anything to do with him for now. Anyway, after saying their farewells, they headed towards the east gate where most Edenian refugees seemed to be from, which was where most of them needed to go. Because of Garen, most of the protected people during their weakest were naturally Edenians. Not to mention, different nationalities naturally didn't get along too well in the beginning. Spats, bad decision-making, bad luck, and many others slowly lessened their numbers unnecessarily bit by bit. Edenians had the highest survival rate, not only because Garen was a capable leader, but also because of the unity of the Edenian soldiers. Among the remaining 14 people, 10 were from Eden. As for the rest, they've no clue where to start, so it was better to move with the team. Vanessa, though, wanted to go with them, but there was no valid reason that wouldn't make her look desperate. She wanted to at least say a sweet goodbye to Garen, but their eyes didn't even meet. Unreconciled, she stepped forward to get closer to him. Be careful, she said, and he only nodded politely before turning away with the team. As the group headed towards the gate, a feminine voice echoed across the whole entrance, making everyone turn their heads simultaneously at the source. Wait, Jakey. The aforementioned man flinched in terror. Oh, good Lord, Jakey. Jake tried to hide his embarrassed blush with a palm on his face. It did not help that the people beside him were mimicking her tone of voice. Oh, Jakey, wait, tilde. Jakey, tilde, tilde, tilde. Oh, Jakey, honey. He glared at the cackling people he used to call friends, and then glared at the woman who was causing him the embarrassment. Yi ran to them, carrying a woven basket on her arm. She looked at him admiringly but hesitated on speaking. What is it? Can I come with you? Jake crossed his arms. Want us to bring another deadweight? But she paused and her head dropped down. Okay. But she wasn't too disappointed. She didn't expect he'd really take her within him anyway. She then passed him the basket she worked on last night. Here, I made these jerkies and dried fruit for you. She had worked part-time in a food processing shop before, and she was actually very good at this. As for why she didn't use the jerky, fruit, and baskets to make more money before, it was because she witnessed someone doing business get bullied. There were too many gangsters and bad guys in the territory. Every area pretty much had some asking for protection fees and more. They couldn't even keep the money they worked for. In this world, money without a bit of power wasn't wealth, it was trouble. Jake's sharp eyes stared at the basket and saw the splinter marks on her hands that were holding it. His stance softened a bit in response as he took the basket. Just go work for Vanessa. You said you're a good cook, right? Yes, I worked a total of 34 part-time jobs, 17 of which were related to cooking, she said proudly. During their bonding time together during the rescue efforts, she had also told him that she had taken jobs in laundry, cleaning and babysitting, and that she would make a great wife. His ex-friends didn't forget to encourage the girl. Don't worry, Yi, we'll watch over him for you. Yes, keep him away from those vixens. Yes, I bet those vixens can't cook as well as our Yi. It so happened that Yi made them some barbecue before, so they knew the girl did have talent. Yi blushed profusely and looked at the group with shining eyes. Yes, please, I'll be sure to make you a lot of food the next time we meet. We'll take you up on that, ha. The soldiers laughed and made more promises, while Jake just covered his face, not knowing whether it was due to humiliation or embarrassment. Too bad Yi wouldn't be the same the next time they get there. Soon, the group finally went ahead to go out. Other than their group of 14, including Gordy, they had Beanie with them. He pretty much appeared all packed up the morning they were set to leave. Something about the dictatorship had no freedom of speech. Poor reporters like him could only suffer extrajudicial killings. And of course, he too had a family to find. In any case, the group, mostly comprised of soldiers level 15 and above, traversed forest after forest, hill after hill, with relative ease. They dealt with the mobs so easily, with Beanie gushing with every element manifested near him. His reporter stats quickly revealed itself. How do you handle the elements? What was it like when you first transferred? He was there when Vincent asked Garen for more details about this strange world, but that was mostly about the world. The more emotional aspect of the story was left out, and he wanted to know more. We transferred here about 4 months ago, all 300. 100 survived the initial transfer, Garen said. Then we inexplicably found out we have a system and a space. 3 months, you guys got really strong. I'm only level 2 after a month. There was no protection period then. Beanie blinked, the implications dawning on him, and he paled. He looked at Garen and the others with a mix of pity and even more respect. It must have been terrifying, he said, squeaking. Well, it could have been worse. Silence occupied the group as they walked. In their heads, they couldn't help but reminisce about what they went through coming here. Althea would be happy to find out you're all right, Beanie said with a smile, and Garen's feet stopped. You have met her. They had lost contact with Beanie because he was adopted by foreigners. Their contact resumed separately many years later, though never as a couple. The chubby man nodded. Had a lot to do with you, in fact. Garen took a deep breath as he started walking again to Beanie's pace. Tell me. Long story, Beanie said in his typical gregarious fashion. It started out when I was chasing a scoop. Straight to Althea, Garen said impatiently, knowing the other's propensity to go on tangents. He reckoned he'd do quite well in creative writing instead. Beanie tutted as he walked, annoyed by being interrupted. He wanted to tease him out of spite but shivered under his stare. So in fear of his life, he told him the story. Ahem, when you guys disappeared, Well, the government tried to keep it under wraps for as long as they could. But over a month passed and there was no news of you. She tried to get information from the government, but no one gave her a direct answer. He frowned. No one bothered to tell her, he asked. His wife of all people had the right to know what happened to him. What happened? In retrospect, he should have asked the general. I happened to be covering the same story. She was with a redhead and the diplomat Mathilda, trying to get more information. I saw her during one of my stakeouts. How was she? What do you think? Garen's jaw tensed and his hands formed fists as they walked. The atmosphere around him turned cold, literally, and Beanie could only rub his shoulders with his hand to keep himself warm. Althea, she must have been heartbroken. She had just lost their parents at the time. How much pain did she have to endure alone? Ansel could be there, sure, but he wasn't very reliable, especially as he was also mourning. Garen knew that Althea was only truly vulnerable and emotionally dependent on him alone, and no one else. Losing him would have hit incredibly hard. The other soldiers nearby were also somber, especially Gil, who heard about his mother, who had worked with Althea to find them. After yet another hour of sadness, with the soldiers venting on small mobs they encountered, Beanie remembered something to lighten up the mood, even for a bit. She got a bit chubby, he told him. And Garen was startled before his shoulders slumped in relief. Chubby, well, that's good. At the time, Althea was only a few months in, and her stomach wasn't obvious. Even Beanie didn't have an idea that Althea was pregnant at all. She must have been stress eating, Beanie thought out loud, earning him a glare. Eating to distract herself, he said. Beanie shut his mouth, afraid to offend this big demon. It was just that after a couple of mobs he just really couldn't do it. He ended up asking questions here and there, chattering about endlessly. It's amazing, how much mana would that take? Did you learn that technique on your own? Sometime later, he turned to Garen. Do you train like those old movies we used to watch? When they were children, they came across some very old movies. It was all they could afford. Using antique playing machines, they managed to scavenge in the bins of rich people. They were mostly martial arts movies, and Beanie was more than a bit obsessed. You can join us train when we settle down, Garen said, wordlessly killing a monster with a sword. Beanie's face scrunched at the exercise. It's to protect your family. Beanie paused and nodded. Fine, he said, they would definitely think I look very cool. As they walked further east, the forest began to look a lot less dense than before, and it looked a bit similar to the forests they had access to as kids. Garen and Beanie couldn't help but be a little nostalgic. They used to play in the forest a lot, which was far from the orphanage, so they spent an hour in the morning traveling concrete to get there. They also had Althea along with them, though her focus was more on plants. I see a lot of unfamiliar plants here, Beanie couldn't help but mumble. I wonder if Althea would eat a random plant again and get poisoned. Garen's feet paused at this, puzzling everyone. Beanie turned to him in confusion, only to see his pale face. He gulped, realizing that what he said frightened the iceberg. I was joking, how could she still be like a 4-year-old, right? Garen nodded, with a determined look on his face. Right, my Althea is so smart. She would absolutely not be poisoned by plants, even if they are unfamiliar, he said, his stoic expression returning, and continued to lead the team forward. If Althea was here, she'd look up at the sky and pretend not to hear anything. Geez, you really haven't changed, Beanie told him, mocking. He then elbowed Garen, his expression turning sly. Hey, tell me, how'd you two, transition to lovers? Garen didn't answer him, though his pace hastened forward, to the point that Beanie struggled to follow. Hey, Beanie yelled, cackling when he saw Garen's ears a bit red. Stop running away. The team watched their interactions with complicated expressions. Other than in relation to his wife, their captain had never been so uncharacteristically human. It seemed that the captain placed a high importance on the reporter, as well. Moving on from the topic, the old friends changed to Beanie's family. What about your wife? Do you have any idea where she is? Garen asked, shifting the topic off him. The two of them reunited when they accidentally met on a mission related to Fargo. Garen actually knew he had been married by virtue of his wedding ring, but he never met his wife. Beanie was also a wife slave, and was successfully distracted from teasing his friend. I was too weak alone and couldn't go out to find my family, he said, and with a smile looked at their team in admiration. Now I can find them safely, preferably with all limbs intact. Well, we'll help you train. Most of the monsters here wouldn't add any experience to us anyway, not even the copper. Really, I owes you. We owed you first, Garen said as they moved forward. Before they could go far, though, the stoic man couldn't help but ask again, was that all you know about her? Beanie nodded apologetically. Yeah, I was in isolation for a while after that. I wasn't able to contact her at all until all this happened, he said, as he was imprisoned for months after revealing government secrets about their disappearance. I was only able to call my wife, but I was too far to reach them in time. Fortunately, Beanie was freed for about a week before the disaster, or else he'd have been guilty for life. I'm sorry for you. No, I did a lot for myself. He said, it's very hard to get a good scoop. I've been stagnant for so long, I wanted to make my wife proud. Beanie's face became soft in remembrance of his beautiful wife. When I married her, I promised heaven and earth, you know. How else would I win such a beautiful woman? It was not entirely for Garen or Althea, but to get a big scoop to bring pride to his beautiful wife. He had always pictured her proud smile, telling him that she was glad she chose him. You must be thinking of your wife, Garen said after a while, making Beanie raise a brow. How'd you know? You look stupid. Heh, you should see how you look when you talk about Althea. Garen shrugged and then proceeded to look stupid indeed. Beanie could only cackle. Hours passed as they traveled east, and the team was now fighting another mob. It was a relatively strong mob with a few level 9 monsters and a number of level 8 minions. Lewis, Plaridel, and Sammy, the lower-leveled ones, dealt with rare monsters level 9 and above because it could still give them experience. Fortunately, there weren't many of this level, or the refugees nearby could only wait for death. Sammy took out a level E bow he bought months ago. It would be too much of a waste to use his level D equipment, which generally handled monsters level 11 and above on such weak monsters. Wind Arrow, he called, and the poor damage of a level E attack increased by a notch, killing the monster in a couple of shots. A moment later, using the same techniques, the dark-skinned man took down another one. There were 4 level 9 monsters in that mob, with the remaining lower-level mob killed early on. Lewis and Plaridel went directly against the 4 monsters, while the long-range attacker Sammy was protected by a wall of fire made by Plaridel. It was thin, as Plaridel needed to manage energy use, but it was enough to redirect the monster's attack for Sammy to make his shot, and Lewis to use his fire sword to deal with the other one. Fire barrier, Plaridel chanted, forming another wall of fire around the remaining monsters to keep them in place. The monsters roared as they were burned, and Lewis quickly slashed his weapon to deal with another one, which had been greatly damaged by Sammy's arrows. Fire slash, he yelled with unnecessary gusto, swiping his fiery blade at the beast. Bang! They watched it go down, finally reducing the 4 monsters to 3. One reason they chanted their attacks was not to look silly. The 2 of them would even argue it sounded cool, but uttering the names of the skills made them easier to manifest and solidify. Ether was such an abstract thing that using it to create complex attacks was a laborious task. Not everyone had brains like the captain or Gil. Plaridel watched as the remaining monsters reached his firewall, and he immediately changed its form to trap them. Raw, the monsters roared in response, using their bodies in an attempt to get out. They didn't care if they were burnt. Unfortunately for the monsters, they couldn't even cross the wall of fire. This fire barrier was a type of firewall, but it was different from the firewall of a mere fire elementalist. If it was by others, the monster could indeed cross, and it would only cause damage to the monster. The fire barrier had combined with his shieldsman occupation, and those trapped inside would not only be damaged, but also legitimately trapped. This was a painful lesson he and other fire shieldsmen learned from those strong aborigines they fought against. Sammy continued to shoot the wind arrow continuously, with most of them hitting good spots. Lewis, on the other hand, waved his flame-covered sword. He relentlessly slashed and parried, the element doubling his attack power as well as its reach. Beanie watched all this in HD, unconsciously walking closer to the fight that he lost an eyebrow. Had he not been pulled back by the collar by Eagle, he'd have lost both. Regardless of the eyebrow hair that remained, he was so very engrossed in what he was watching that he didn't take note of it at all. So cool, he mumbled, turning to the soldier next to him. Level 10 right, level 10 and I'll be able to use elements right, he asked, eyes bright with excitement. He had wind affinity. With this thought, he vowed to work even harder. Soon, they encountered a small mob of monsters, disabled by the team and killed by Beanie. By the time the sky darkened and they had to rest for the night a few hours later, Beanie was promoted from the base of level 3 to the middle of level 4. "Yes, I'll definitely make it up to you guys," he yelled, calming down a bit as he helped the team set up camp. The soldiers shrugged, not really minding the trouble at all. After all, a friend of the captain was also their friend. Beanie refused to not be able to show his gratitude, however, and insisted on giving rewards. After a thought, he just promised them one of the best rewards he, personally, received. "I'll get my beautiful wife to make you her signature dishes." Sammy couldn't help but stare at the former chubby reporter in inquiry. He was really not attractive. How beautiful could his wife be? So in classic Sammy fashion, he asked. "Tusk, you don't know. I prayed to different gods when I was pursuing her." He showed a printed photo of their family of 4. "Here," he said, proudly presenting the photo. "I will also bless your eyes with my beautiful baby boy." Sammy's eyebrows rose. It was indeed a beautiful woman and a cute child. He looked up at Beanie and then the picture again. "Did you take a DNA test?" He couldn't help but joke. "Yow!" Beanie gasped in great offense, grabbing the other man's shoulder to headbutt him. Unfortunately for him, Sammy was a soldier 10 levels stronger than he was and effortlessly avoided his attack. However, Beanie did not give up, and he continued to run after the man to issue his revenge. It was quite silly, and quite a few people laughed. "You gasp, jerk, gasp," Beanie mumbled bitterly, rubbing the sweat on his face. Sammy's lips twitched. Yes, I was just joking," he said, handing the photo back to Beanie. "The little boy has your inquisitive eyes." All of Beanie's annoyance was wiped away by the comment, and he brightened up immediately as he hugged the photo. "Well, you got good eyes," he said before sitting down next to the campfire Lewis made. Beanie made sure to secure the photo in the space, of course. It was just that, if Althea and the others were here, they'd recognize the woman and child in the photo. One of them was even a team member now. Priya and Theo, the team woke up before dawn, starting their travel further east even before the sun rose. If the monsters were level 7 and above, the team dealt with it fairly quickly, not wanting to delay their travels too much. But when they encountered a mob of levels 3 through 4, they would kill most while retaining the weaker ones, whilst heavily injuring them. Beanie blinked as he watched this. He flinched when Sammy walked next to him. "Didn't you say you want to reach level 10 quickly?" he said as he wrapped his dark arms around the portly man, before pushing him forward, basically throwing him into the monsters' mouths. The poor man squealed. Luckily for him, the monsters were mostly discounted and fell down before they reached him. "Hey, that was pathetic. I wish I had my camera to show your wife." Beanie gasped but smiled smugly. "My wife happens to love me no matter what." "Raw," he squealed again. "Hey, we don't have the whole day." Beanie shook his head and stood up immediately. Right, everyone had family to look for. It was already very kind to give him these few minutes to level up. And he was determined to work hard. A few minutes later. It was really not easy. He was sweaty and gasping, and he barely did any damage to the monster. "You need to try harder than that, Beanie," Sammy yelled when he saw Beanie rolling around trying to avoid the monster's attack. Even Sammy's teasing didn't get to him, primarily because the dude was also a wind element and may or may not be his master in the future. Gil got impatient, though, and burned the monster's remaining legs with magma. It roared and fluttered about, which gave Beanie enough time to gather his bearing. "Kill it." "Oh yes, he said, seeing the heavily weakened level 4 monster in front of him. Although Garen and the others helped carry his level, they tried not to coddle. There was always some life left on the monsters, albeit they were greatly weakened and had a disability of sorts. At this time, the enemy was a monster called Kui with sharp horns and flat face. 2 of its legs were barely usable. It was humiliating to ask for more cheats. Beanie gathered himself and fought with it bravely, slash, parry and pack. Eventually, he did earn a couple of nick. "Don't focus too much strength on your arms, you'll get tired easily," Garen told him with that monotonous voice of his. It was a good enough tip for Beanie, though, who changed things up a bit. Oh. He had a preference for the axe, it looked cool, and and swung it with all his might, i.e. all his weight. His packing improved and was soon able to make the killing shot. Killed Kui LV4, plus 100 experience, plus 100 copper. The group continued to travel swiftly across the mountains, giving Beanie the occasional monster every few hours or so. By the time he was on his third mob many hours later and kilometers away from their camping site, he was at the peak of level 4. Of course, if they weren't in such a rush, Beanie would definitely be at least level 5 now. It was just that by this time, he only had enough spirit and health to keep walking, so the succeeding monsters regardless of level had been dealt with by the soldiers. They pretty much bulldozed their way east, and Beanie could only shake his head in wonder. "These monsters seem really weak in front of you guys," he said, and Garen gave him a pointed look. "Weaker monsters are around weaker territories." "I'm trying to say you are strong, not that they're weak," Beanie gasped. He couldn't let him have a moment of complacency. Garen shrugged. It was Gil who couldn't help but express another snide remark. "Outside, these monsters are relatively weak. Level 4s like you are still playing at home with their mummies." And Sammy, this jerk, laughed out loud. "You'll see if I get strong." Beanie was ready to argue when he saw the soldiers halted, and the light atmosphere changed somehow. Everybody's steps paused as the scenery in front of them changed. It's a wall. No, not anymore. Several pairs of eyes looked at the sight in front of them in disbelief. It was a low-level village, as shown by the level 2 walls and buildings, except there was no sign life. There were only mountains of corpses, none of whom had complete body parts, with visible muscles and sinews attached. The beasts had a feast here not too long ago, they could tell. Looking at how things were, there were thousands of bodies lying there, waiting to be consumed by maggots and buried in time. The buildings had already begun to disintegrate as well. Bit by bit, they disappeared into nothingness. Each dust the wind carried was a hit on their hearts. The territories of Terran were still so vulnerable. "What?" Beanie squeaked, almost falling down from the shock. The soldiers, used to the sight of death, quickly gathered themselves, although one could tell with the shaking hands and pale faces that they were no less shocked. Garen heaved a deep breath. "Help them," he ordered, and everyone immediately went to the various corpses and arranged them together into a single place. At the same time, they hoped not to see anyone familiar among the dead. Each corpse carried to the center made everyone look in both apprehension and pain, praying that there was no one familiar to them. Fortunately, except for Lewis' classmate who he wasn't very close with, and Sammy with a neighbor he didn't like, no one else found anyone they knew. Still, seeing someone you once knew alive, and well dead in such a horrific manner, made them feel depressed regardless. "Let's send them off," Garen said, voice in a lower, heavier register than usual. On cue, all the fire users surrounded the corpses in the middle, using the ability to light them on fire. They watched in silence as the corpses burned, returning to the ground. It was a pity they had to stay in this foreign place forever, not even having the luxury of dying in their own land. About an hour later, the corpses had completely turned to ashes, and there was nothing left but them mourning. Garen looked at his team that entered a gloomy mood and sighed. "Let's go," he just said, and the team prepared to go on their way. Beanie sniffed, feeling very heavy. To be honest, he had been compartmentalizing in order to retain some cohesiveness. Although he had also seen a lot of deaths in his previous 2 territories, he knew his family wasn't there nor were they nearby. But now they were so near other Eden territories, and this was what he kept on seeing. He shook his head, refusing to think about it anymore. Rather than be crippled with worry, he'd rather move forward to get to as many territories as he could to find his family. The team soon went their way further east, though no one spoke a word anymore. It was just that they hadn't gone far when they heard rustles, a lot of them, approaching relatively quickly. The soldiers immediately raised their guards ready for whatever would come. The distant sounds were quickly followed by yells and screams. The soldiers looked at each other, but otherwise stood still as they listened to the many rushed footsteps that came their way. A crowd of hundreds appeared, batch by batch, from the dense forests. Each one looked absolutely horrid, covered with blood and dirt, and their expressions filled with terror and hopelessness. They were running for their lives, only, deep in their hearts, they didn't think they'd have much hope of succeeding at all. But it didn't mean they would stop trying. "Run, run," they yelled, seeing people blocking their way. The team stood still and watched as scores and scores of fleeing people rushed in and went past them in a flurry. The people didn't have time to wonder why they were unmoving and just continued to run as far as they could. They rushed in like ants suddenly escaping from the nest, avoiding the obstacles that were them, and they were such in a rush that most didn't even bother to avoid them. It was just that as a few people bumped into them, they were thrown back by the force instead. What? They asked, but flinched when they saw the soldiers, standing still as if another man his size didn't just barrel onto him, looked down at them with an impassive expression. Too scared to make an issue out of it, they just ignored the soldiers and continued to escape. Of course, some had the mind to warn them. For instance, a middle-aged bald man wearing only a dirty white shirt stopped next to them, yelling, "What are you doing? Run." The man tried to drag one with him, but the person shook his head. Gil looked at the man who was pulling his arm, actually stopping to pull him despite looking incredibly terrified by what was behind. Instead of speaking, though, Gil looked at the incoming monster without emotion. Ignoring the man's curse, he easily escaped the man's hold and summoned fire in one hand and earth in the other. The man didn't absorb what was happening until Gil was several steps away, baffling him. What? He wasn't so stressed out that blood crept up his brain, did it? Gil coolly met the monster's sprint and jumped up. He clapped his hands together while in the air, forming magma between his hands. He then raised his hand above his head and pounded the monster's head with his palms burning with magma. "Magma melt," he uttered under his breath, watching as his technique burned a hole into the monster's skin. Whatever the magma touched, it melted like it was a gruesome ice cream. This was just the first of the miraculous sights the refugees saw. They soon saw the whole team light up in different colors as different elements manifested around them. Every and each one, including Beanie and Gordy, fought the monsters, each one looking valiant in the eyes of the refugees, especially the elementalists who looked so divine in their movements, no matter which element they commanded. More and more people stopped running, watching the lights and magical sights with all their hearts, sending a flick of hope into their dying hearts. Each ember lit a fire, each rock added stability, each gust adding excitement, adding a breath of life, and the crowd watched in amazement as the monster mob that tortured them so much was dealt with so easily by fellow humans. In fact, the people who didn't have elements were also impressive and even more inspiring, because they represented what they could do themselves, rather than the miracles, the soldiers, that happened to come their way. "Awesome axe," Beanie exclaimed, naming his own technique for coolness. Although it wasn't a skill and didn't consume mana, he felt it was stronger by virtue of its name. Fortunately, the monster he was up against was another level 4 weakened by Lewis, so he managed to kill it unscathed. Gordy, a level 14, was not an elementalist, but he could also handle himself very well. He was a spear user, and he swung his weapon around expertly. Although he had gotten rusty after years of not fighting, he was still quite impressive. It had to be said that Gordy was among the people who survived among his kind for a reason. When someone asked why he remained a cleaner slave despite having the ability to do decently in villages and even low-level towns, he said it was because slaves who could fight were sent to the front lines with no support but themselves. In their Terran terms, they would be called cannon fodders or meat shields. In contrast, cleaning up the mercenary hall was just much more attractive. Eventually, the battle ended and the team stood still, while the atmosphere around them brewed with various emotions. The refugees looked at each other with wide eyes, some were disbelieving, while some just sobbed. They're alive, they're safe. It's a miracle. At the sight of saviors and survivors, the heavy atmosphere from both parties immediately lit up. Instead of speaking, Garen simply led the bigger team to continue on as if nothing happened. They could catch up eventually, but their loved ones couldn't wait anymore. Not to mention, more mobs could be attracted by all this blood. There were so many refugees, and only over a dozen of them. They wouldn't be able to protect all of these people, even if they had an overwhelming strength advantage against the monsters they encountered. So this was why the team didn't stop to chat. Rather, the two groups simply converged into a line. The refugees understood and followed, and behaved, while unable to stop giving admiring gazes at the soldiers, but were afraid to act too closely. Although they had good impressions of soldiers, the corrupt guards of their former territories unconsciously made them afraid of people in power. Especially such powerful people, they're probably very arrogant, right? It didn't help that when they encountered a mob, they were dealt with in a few blinks. Such strong monsters with thick-skinned were killed so easily. If they offended these people, would they get pulverized? So the group of 300 people walked in silence for hours, until it was time for dinner. They camped in a relatively large clearing they found after clearing out the mobs they encountered, using them as meat by the way. The more gregarious soldiers like Lewis started talking to the refugees as the others prepared the food, with the help of tens of refugees, of course. "So, what happened to you guys?" The people near him flinched a bit but saw he was a young lad with a friendly smile, their shoulders slumped in relief. "Our territory fell as well. We were allies with Porter, the territory where we met, but... well, at least we survived." Lewis nodded. "Is this all of you, from your old territory?" Well, everyone panicked and ran to different directions. I see. Then did you happen to encounter someone with the name?" Lewis began to enumerate various names, though no information about them was found. Similarly, the other soldiers saw this and followed his lead. However, even with this, no one got news that they wanted. "Well, no news is good news," Sammy said with an awkward smile, trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "It would be better than hearing they perished, right?" With that, the sad topic was temporarily put aside, and the teams focused on filling their stomachs for another day of fighting ahead. For dinner, they had barbecue using the meat of the monsters they just killed. The refugees were the ones who cleaned up the meat, while the soldiers handled it with a diluted version of the captain's signature sauce. Adding a bit of their seasoning to improve the taste, the aroma that wafted to everyone's noses automatically made their stomachs churn. The soldiers asked them to line up properly, and they were for the most part behaved, no matter how impatient they were. They left the meat in the center, and anyone could take it. Fortunately, there wasn't anyone expecting to be served and filed properly, only taking one per person. What they didn't know was that there were indeed people who had planned on using moral kidnapping, but the coldness of the captain scared them to death. Soon, the first batch of refugees managed to get a hold of a stick, immediately bringing them to their mouths, and they almost cried. "Amazing," they said, even if they burned their tongues a bit for being too hasty. Some people even outright sobbed, happy to finally taste something decent. More than the luxury of flavor, it was more an excitement to the soul. Gil looked around and found someone. He was lined up near the end. Gil approached him, ignoring the ogles of the others, especially the women. "You," he called the bald man from earlier. "May, what's your name?" "It's Rodney." "You're not bad," he said and handed him a seasoned meat and some cotton pants. His eyes sparkled, but he was a little puzzled by the special treatment, so he was reluctant to take it immediately. Gil sighed and just left the items in his hand before returning to the group, leaving a dumbfounded Rodney standing. Garen's team started eating their own food, while the others set up their own fires and stoves. Some were creative and added some familiar fruits and herbs, while some really knew how to handle the tangy monster meats. The soldiers were also eating quite happily when a soft, sultry voice sounded next to them. "May I also have?" Lewis and Sammy gaped at the beautiful woman who approached them. Lewis abruptly stood up, recognizing her immediately. She was wearing plain clothing and was a little dirty, but the pretty face of Terran's biggest female star was still recognizable. She was also of normal weight, still quite sexy, unlike many of her companions who were emaciated. Miss Junie, wow, I'm a fan. Junie was a starlet that debuted just a few years prior, but was shot up to stardom by talent and some well-chosen movies and dramas. By the time the migration happened, she was already one of the biggest stars. In fact, she had just won Eden's most prestigious Best Actress award before the migration happened. Lewis had followed her since her debut and was very excited to interact with her. He looked around. "Is Fable here? He's my idol." Junie smiled awkwardly. "Don't listen to rumors. We were barely even friends." Lewis nodded, even if a bit disappointed. However, he soon snapped out of it as he thought she was hungry, so he happily gave her a stick of meat. "Thank you," she said, releasing a gorgeous smile. Fanbo Lewis was taken to the stars by her smile. What he didn't expect was the woman's eyes turned to give furtive glances in a direction. It wasn't obvious at first, but he caught her doing so more than once as she ate. Lewis blinked curiously and followed her line of sight, ending on their deputy. Why would Junie be looking at Deputy Captain Gil? Junie frowned when she looked at Gil, not even turning to her direction, even when they were only a meter apart. But Junie didn't say anything. She just ate her piece and thanked the group for the hospitality, paying a piece of silver before going. Lewis naturally tried to reject it, but she shook her head. "Please, it is for my own comfort," she said, and Lewis reluctantly accepted the money. While mysterious, no one really thought too deeply about it, and the group soon went on their way, with torches on hand lit by the fire users in the team. This was a novel experience for the people, to travel so long at night time with so much light. A few hours later, the line stopped, and the crowd curiously looked at what caused it in front. Some even walked closer to see, and everyone looked at what was in front of them in awe. A stone wall, a 3-meter-high one at that, and a level 3 wall meant there were sentries. This was a territory, a strong one. The people cheered and they immediately went to the gates, entering with anticipation of some well-deserved rest. And when the familiar ding resounded inside their heads, everyone smiled. Finally, they mused and immediately looked at the name of the territory to remember it by. "Welcome to Bright Village, welcome to Bright Village. Please pay 5 copper coins as visitor's fee." Everyone looked at each other, surprised, half wondering if they were imagining things. "Am I seeing it correctly, 5 copper? So cheap. I've never encountered a territory charging so little." Similar chatter resounded among their group of 300 plus, but their feet never stopped moving, eager to know more about this curious territory. As such, the mighty group of refugees and soldiers entered the territory with a bit of anticipation. They went past the gate and were immediately met with a 6-meter-wide road. They walked along it curiously, as, during the first leg of about a few hundred meters, the view was pure forest. However, after passing this, the road immediately became lively. The roads were abutted by a few 2-story buildings similar to some villages they'd been to. There were other familiar buildings like the restaurant, weapons shop, and armor shop. Despite these, there were also plenty of unique elements. For instance, there were 5 commercial buildings with 2 floors, looking quite different from the rest. It was interestingly unique in appearance, with a stone ground floor and wooden upper floors. They weren't able to appreciate it too much though. They weren't even able to see what they sell, because the liveliest aspect of the roads took all their attention. The stalls. And they were shocked by the fact that they were selling food they didn't think they'd encounter again. "Are those French fries?" Mao the foodie was the first to exclaim. His narrow eyes widened like he had double eyelids. "Rice cake," Lewis beside him gulped as he stared at the stall next to it. Sammy, on the other hand, focused on the commercial buildings. He even entered one and quickly sent news. "They sell clothes here. It's cotton and hemp, I think, and they are cheap." In fact, cloth was still a luxury product in the territory. It was just that decent clothing was very expensive in Xeno. This was not even a fraction of the price outside. The newcomers, especially the refugees, had sparkling eyes. In fact, the soldiers were still held back. The refugees, after absorbing they were really not dreaming, all spread out like a group of kids set free in a candy aisle. Each one went to a specific stall of choice, vocally admiring it as if it were a museum piece. "Amazing. Gosh, is this jam." "Noodles," one yelled, threw money without checking for change and sipped. He moaned out, "I'm in heaven. How did they do it? This is amazing." The citizens of Bright could hear the discussions of the newcomers and smiled with pride. "Of course, our Lord is very good. He's even gathered very good seeds for us and set up farms so we could be self-sufficient. The first harvest will be in another week or so, I think," he said. "The prices would be even cheaper then." The team couldn't help but look at each other with relieved smiles in their eyes as they heard this. At least they knew some Terrans were doing well, and this meant their families could also be in such territories as well. In any case, they had a very good impression of the lord of this place. "He must be a good guy," Lewis said with an admiring nod, and everyone, even if they didn't speak, agreed. Then they proceeded to walk along the street, stomach grumbling. Seeing his team wanting to attack each stall they passed by, Garen shook his head. "Let's find a place to stay first," he said, pulling everyone back to the present. Indeed, they came with hundreds of people. What if there was no accommodation left for their team? Garen, Gil, and a few proceeded to ask the locals where they could find places to rent, while the rest said goodbye to the refugees. Thank you so much for saving us," several people said, many of whom bowed in gratitude before parting with them. "Have this please," Rodney stepped forward, handing over a basket of food he just bought. With his aid, a lot of people followed. "This too. Please have this." The soldiers were a bit surprised and touched, but they didn't reject the kindness of the refugees. It was good to know that they were not taken for granted. The team separated from the refugees, receiving their heartfelt thanks once more. Of course, as always, there were still some dissatisfied with their lack of help in settling them down. However, they had seen their strengths and didn't dare to speak out. The team proceeded to look for available housing. Most of the houses had already been occupied. It was a recent thing, apparently, as a lot of people apparently made a lot of money from selling products. They eventually found one of the two-story houses a bit farther from the main road. According to locals, it was a new community, with the Lord using a new housing module from the system. It had a similar appearance to the new commercial areas near the gates. 2 stories, relatively steep roofing with corners slightly curving up, and with a quaint combination of wood and stone, giving the impression of both stability and flexibility. There were only 5 units in total, and the rent was very expensive. However, they had no choice but to take it as it was the only available one after leaving the cheaper rentals to the refugees. After confirming the rent, the mercenary team members filed in, not really expecting anything too special. However, when they went inside, they were amazed by how clean and organized it was. There were proper flooring and partitions, and the room arrangements were similar to open plans back in Terran. The furniture was also very complete, and there was complete upholstery. There were even rugs made of beast fur. The more sensitive ones even closed their eyes and felt another difference: the temperature. It was Chris who spoke out. "This is very interesting," he said. "It is hot outside, but the inside is much cooler." He opened his eyes and studied the house further, realizing that this was done by maximizing wind and air temperature. They also saw some unfamiliar translucent materials, used as windows and lamps. "This is so interesting. Probably a custom house, right? The designer must be very knowledgeable about this. Amazing, they hadn't been here for a month, right? It's official, the Lord here is my idol." Excited to explore, the younger members ran to the rooms, and they scuttled out, looking at the rest of the team in awe. "The house here has toilets," Lewis yelled, and Sammy immediately flinched. "Fudge, seriously?" The 2 men immediately went to check on the toilets together, admiring it. After all, it had been so long since they saw a legitimate water closet. This place was like the medieval period of their Terran planet. It was already a luxury to have a hole to shit on. Most commoners would use chamber pots, still the ultra-cheap kind, because metal wasn't readily accessible to most. Anyway, it was super gross. "A legit kitchen counter, too," Eagle said with a smile. He remembered the raw materials he saw on the market. Can he finally prepare a legitimate meal? It seemed the price for this house was worth it after all. Compared to anywhere they've lived in since coming, this was a real luxury. Not to mention Gordy, who had lived in extreme poverty for decades. This was akin to living in the palace. Seeing the house, the group had completely been won over by the territory. "When I find my family, I might just settle here." "Me too." Garen nodded. If Althea wasn't good enough, assuming it wasn't hers as they suspected, and if she didn't like indigenous towns like Feral, they could indeed settle here instead. After all, even if a town was more convenient and bigger, it was still different to be surrounded by brethren. Well, whatever his wife preferred. As such, the team excitedly headed back out to finally eat their fill, to appreciate this unique territory even more. This could possibly be their new home, after all. The group happily went to the market and ordered everything they could get their hands on. They ate French fries, rice cakes, rice with monster meat, etc. It had to be noted that the offerings were mostly rice and potato-based food, which was just what they needed. It didn't bother them that they were green or blue or red. Even if it was rainbow-colored, they'd eat it. "They're building a kiln, and soon we'll offer bread as well," the vendor couldn't help but announce proudly. "That's amazing." Sometime later, they then went to the barbecue stall next to it. They had thought that it probably wasn't anything too special, considering they already had the boss sauce. But then they saw the array of available sauces, and they couldn't help but gape. Soy sauce, Mao uttered, and Lewis echoed beside him. Vinegar. The soldiers looked at each other, shocked at the choices, then they were fired up, decidedly buying a bit of everything. The group also ordered various meats and vegetables on skewers to gobble. They were all consuming quite well for a while, their abbed stomachs slowly bubbling out of shape. Of course, they really wouldn't care about shape right now. They cared more about how much more it could take before they couldn't eat anymore. It was a peaceful time for a shopping spree for a while. It was just that sometime as they were walking along the street and enjoying various street foods, Gil's hand with the skewer paused. He sighed, and to his team's puzzlement, he turned his head to a direction. "How long will you keep watching?" he asked, and Lewis and the others blinked, not sure who he was talking to. And then their mouths opened in shock when they saw a familiar gorgeous woman emerging from the crowd. Junie, the young soldiers and citizens gaped and looked on in admiration. Junie only smiled at them, but her attention quickly focused on the sexy man who was looking at her impassively. "You were eating so happily," she said with a smile. "Can we talk?" Why? Lewis and Sammy couldn't help but mumble. Why would she want to talk to you? "I mean, you're handsome, but you really can't speak well." Gil massaged his throbbing temple in annoyance, swearing to train these brats hard, so they didn't sound so stupid every time they opened their mouths. "We used to date." "What? Holy gougieberry. What, you? What about Miss Cassandra?" Mao, as someone bribed by Cassandra with food to hint at some of Gil's personal details, blurted out with a frown. He froze when he realized his gaffe, and raised his hand in surrender when Gil sent him a warning glance. The handsome soldier then turned to look at the beautiful woman for a few moments, before finally nodding. Junie's tense shoulder relaxed a little, and she led him to one of the restaurants at a corner shop. The group looked at the back of the former couple with complicated expressions. Even Garen didn't know about Gil's love life. When Gil said that he watched too many of his ex's dramas, Garen didn't think he meant it like that. Then he couldn't help but recall the much better condition of the woman compared to the others. Although he didn't have an interest in anything other than Althea and his job, he had still heard some things about the deep water of the entertainment industry. It was not hard to assume what she could have been doing all this time, and was a bit worried for Gil. Of course, he knew that this thought was extremely judgmental and unfair. Not to mention, this was none of his business, at least until it started to affect the functions of the team. Putting the thought aside, he turned his attention back to the bustling market street, as well as the people's happy faces. Whatever the case, it was really, truly, good to know that there were still Terran territories that were doing well. "I pray Althea's living well." Garen entered a short daze at that time, warmly thinking about his wife. Sandra was shopping when she saw his frozen figure. Her heart skipped a beat the moment she realized who it was. This man was still as handsome as ever. However, she also knew of his temperament, and approaching him now would just set herself up for embarrassment. Not to mention, her lover had been watching her moves lately. It didn't help that Ron and Spike told him about her alleged flirting with other men back in Altera. Even if she had managed to pass the blame to Ramona, the seeds of doubt had been planted, and it was getting increasingly difficult to satisfy him. She frowned at the thought of Ron and Spike. She swore she'd deal with them someday. But whatever dark thought was brewing in her mind, though, her eyes never left Garen. She stood there watching, and when she saw that they moved to another stall, she also followed as subtly as she could. She gulped, her heart beating wildly, her eyes filled with the dashing May with deep azure eyes. Maybe, just maybe, she'd finally find a chance to climb up. Sandra did not have to wait long to see a chance to approach. Make way, make way." A group of injured people carried 3 men who were dripping with blood. They watched as the severely injured people were carried to one of the commercial buildings. The sideboard indicated it was a pharmacy/clinic. The soldiers were curious. How was the medicinal capacity of this territory, they wondered. After all, it was still a village, and it didn't have a system pharmacy yet. Without a word, they followed the crowd to observe. Soon a pitiful group of bloodied people were either carried or guided inside the building. They looked very much in pain and very worried. However, it was worth noting that did not appear hopeless. which was very different to the refugees they had seen so far. In contrast to those people's dull eyes, these people were hopeful that their teammates getting treated well. The difference between territories could be seen even from this. "Please save them," they exclaimed, and a doctor knelt down to take a look at the wounded as his assistant stopped the bleeding for the others. After a moment, he turned to the ambulatory members with an apologetic frown. "We do have basic medicine for everyone, but we only have 2 bottles left of Band-Aid and Sprite. In their case, it can't be diluted unless we get the premium grade." The team's shoulders slumped, but they still chose the more critical people to use the remaining bottles. The soldiers watched as the group paid tons of gold, and the shop owner brought out a box of bottles, as well as other things. It seemed that with that bunch of gold, the party not only bought the medicine, but also other solutions and some so-called special gauze. Garen and the others watched as the medicine was applied, and were surprised to see that it immediately stopped bleeding. It even closed up a bit. Turbo's eyes widened, surprised, but there was no one to answer his questions. The medical personnel continued to treat the wounded guards for half an hour, before they finally heaved a sigh of relief. Someone checked their inventory and sighed even deeper, looking at his workmates. "I wonder when the martial law will be lifted. We need to stock up on supplies from Althea." The word immediately sent alerts to a lot of the soldiers. Garen immediately appeared next to the nearest nurse, who happened to be a meek female. He was a meter away, but his presence was overbearing. It didn't help that he was very, very handsome, and it had the tendency to destroy a shy girl's heart. "All these things came from Althea?" he asked. His baritone voice was handsome but extremely scary. The nurses and doctors were frightened. Sandra, who was nearby, saw this as her opportunity. She began to approach, her eyes on him. Sandra was determined to replace the poor female nurse, who was both adoring and scared as she looked at his face. "Why, yes," the nurse said, and she couldn't help blushing at the focus of the deep azure eyes anyone could drown in. Garen frowned, and seeing as this one couldn't give him the answer he needed, he turned his head to another medical professional, a male this time. "Tell me, please." Sandra's pace hastened as she finally reached a few meters from the dashing soldier. Similarly, the male nurse had already opened his mouth to answer when a ding sounded in his head. Or rather, an announcement popped up above every person's head, including the visitors. "No one is allowed to reveal anything about Althea other than the Lord. Leak at your own risk." The male nurse, Sandra, who had wanted to offer her help. The atmosphere stagnated, and for some reason it made Garen's eyelids twitch. He had a bad feeling about this half an hour prior. Mitchell was drinking a precious tea blend inside his study, overlooking the territory he created in a complex mood. He had done his best, but the world outside was too dangerous not to worry. "Sip good tea." He bought this tea from Althea for a very high price, and as he savored the warm drink, he could feel his stress and worry diminishing at a palpable rate. As expected of the woman who could handle that man with ease. In any case, he was perusing the population list in this better mood when a group of people appeared and shot up the top of the list, which made it stagnate again. He was curious and a little apprehensive at first, but then he saw the name at the very top. Immediately, he stiffened and his jaw tensed, his eyes turning darker at the sight of it. Garen Witt, the man that caused them huge amounts of losses just because of his intervention. One could imagine how his blood boiled when he saw him finally landing in his territory. Mitchell's blue eyes narrowed, a dark smirk gracing his lips. He would finally be able to deal with this guy. As for why he didn't deal with either Ansel or Althea, it was against his principles to drag innocents into battles. Also, he'd lose a lot if he went against them, especially for something they didn't even have a hand in. Anyway, this bastard cost him a lot of money, and he was determined to get it back, maybe even get interest. He stood up and walked outside, attempting to see the bastard for himself. Although he knew the man had gotten much stronger for reasons unknown, he still hoped to see him bloodied and desperate. However, as he went on the streets, he saw another batch of his own guards bloodied by the strong monsters outside. He sighed. The protection period was indeed the newbie period. The current challenges of the monsters were incomparable. If he had more resources, he'd have bought more of the premium weapons from Althea. Sadly, he was also very poor. He also had to buy the custom houses, because he found out that it would disappear if unclaimed after 32 days. He had seen the advantages and had already purchased the blueprint from Oslo, and he couldn't bear to put that all to waste. And so, he jumped in despite the huge costs, which were truly beyond his means. He should have known each module cost a lot more than the standard buildings. Furthermore, after that warning from Althea, he naturally had to go above and beyond his capabilities to protect the territory. That handful of customized houses, upgraded fences and sentries, though very sparsely placed every few hundred meters, they really cost too much, had siphoned out all his funds. He even had to borrow from his subordinates, as well as solicit from citizens in exchange for some added status. That was, these people would have priority in his new amenities, etc. Fortunately, everyone was cooperative. Anyway, they easily saw where the money went. Not to mention, he knew that the investments on custom houses would return to him in a short while, and he'd have some funds again. He still needed more, however, and it was a worrying thought. Then he remembered he'd have another source of income, one that was coming to his own doorstep very soon. With a smile, he sent an announcement to all his residents, walking to the meeting hall to wait for his next pot of gold. Garin found his location several minutes later, with 2 of his men. Mitchell also had Dig, and the only fighter aborigine he had, Juno. Juno was a level E soldier at level 15. Not bad compared to his people, but not impressive compared to Ultra's aborigine, who was also an elemental. Sigh, he really ought to stop comparing to Ultra. That place was in its own league. Speaking of aborigines, he had a vague inkling that Ultra really took most of the good hires available at their level. After all, Ultra upgraded much earlier than they did, primarily because of its ample funds and foresight. It was very likely that it had managed to get most of the decent options. Pity, but it could have been worse. At the very least, Ultra was an ally and wasn't a territory he had to worry about. A couple of minutes later, 3 soldiers including Garin entered the meeting hall looking all intimidating, as always, but Mitchell's aura when negotiating wasn't much less. Lord of Bright, Garin started, that apathetic low voice of his bland as always. My name is Garin Witt, and these are my men Gil and Eagle. They greeted him politely and he stood up with a smile. He walked over and extended his hand. My name is Mitchell Bertie. Garin imperceptibly flinched, and his azure eyes sharpened as he looked at the blonde. This man. Bertie was an infamous mafia family spanning 5 generations. It was just that the current generation cleaned up the family, no longer selling drugs. They sold only weapons to security companies and some other private non-terrorist groups. This itself was not too illegal, so when he caught up with them, they got out by paying an ample amount of money. This amount of money happened to be a good bulk of the liquid funds he had. You seem to recognize me, Mitchell said, donning a mysterious smile, extending his hand to meet his handshake. Garin's face showed no change when he answered. Your surname is quite well known. Of course, he said, his grip tightening a bit. Too bad we still lost to a 20-plus-year-old soldier. Garin sighed, finally knowing for sure what the announcement was about. With their history, it would be questionable if this lord didn't make it hard on him. In fact, the ban on the information was definitely on purpose, just to annoy him. There is news that I want. Yes, I know, I definitely have the information you want, he said enticingly, smirking. It's not cheap. It depends on the information. Mitchell smiled handsomely, but it only brought creeps down their spines. I can tell you exactly how to get to Altera, he said, and watched as Garin's back straightened in anticipation, as well as information about your wife and brother. Garin's eyes widened and he raised his head. The 2 men beside Mitchell immediately went on defensive under his strong aura, but Mitchell only flinched a bit, not showing any weaknesses. Instead, he leaned over with his chin on the back of his hands, smiling. The price will definitely not be low. Aberdeen City, many years ago. One weekend in the early summer, the family was gathered in the kitchen by Althea. They were well behaved and waited patiently as to what this was all about, and they soon saw Althea bringing in a colourful array of jars. These jars were filled with vibrant tea leaves, fragrant herbs, and delicate flower petals. The school was off the week, with Ansel and the 2 professors were relaxing at home. There was also Garin, a special military soldier, who was also on a rare day off. The parents curiously looked at her. Her boyfriend, as always, was just watching her dotingly, while her little brother had a teasing smile on his face. I have been studying and testing these for a long time. How many times did you get poisoned? Ansel asked, and Althea answered with a bit of smugness. None. Not because you're immune now, right? Later. Alicia laughed and gently tapped the boy's head. Let Althea have her moment. Chi, Ansel tutted and crossed his arms, though his eyes quickly gravitated back to the curious table in front of him. Althea cleared her throat, entering a small zone she entered during her experiment, albeit a milder version. She smiled as she delicately scooped a blend of loose leaves into each teapot, adding different herbs and flowers to each one. Soon aroma wafted into her audience's noses, making her audience unconsciously lean down the table for a bit more of a sniff. For a while, only the sound of porcelain and metal clashing, combined with rustles of tiny leaves, was heard in the room. Finally, she ended the ritual with pouring hot water on the cups, placing a different blend in front of each them. They looked brightly at the beautiful blend in front of them, sniffing the nice aromas that whiffed up their noses. Althea smiled and started to introduce her work. For Dad, I've chosen an exquisite blend of dried rose petals and camilla tea leaves, smart and bold, fitting Dad's scholarly pursuits. Howard laughed in his characteristic deep and hearty laugh, taking the cup for a sip. His eyebrows rose as the aroma and taste enveloped him. It was as if transporting to a distant rose garden in full bloom. Althea judged it to be a success and turned to her mother. For Mom, it is a blend of green tea, lavender and chamomile, a fragrant bouquet that was calming as it is rejuvenating, much like what she is to me. Alicia giggled. Tilda, thanks love, I'll try it out now. She inhaled the soothing aroma of the concoction as she sniffed, and it felt like she was strolling through a serene lavender field, very relaxing. Ansel's is a fruit-infused herbal tea with hints of apple, hibiscus, and orange peel. It's a playful medley of flavors, a fitting drink for our youngest. The redhead immediately took his cup, a bit excited, and was met with the tasty fruity explosion in his mouth. Delicious Tilda. They all chuckled at his reaction, and soon Althea turned to her handsome boyfriend, who made her blush a bit under his deep stare. For Garin, it shall be a robust blend of black tea, mint leaves, and a touch of lemongrass. It is bold and invigorating, much like you. Thank you, Althea. He smiled and took a sip, met with a refreshing burst of mint that invigorated his senses, though his eyes never left her face. Is it tasty? She asked, blushing a bit before turning to everyone else. Everyone nodded, praising her for her talents. In any case, the kitchen that day was particularly fragrant, filled with warmth and happiness. And the contentment of a complete family. Bright village present. Garin stood up in shock and looked at him murderously. Even his two guards who tried to defend couldn't move, startled by the man's aura. Mitchell coolly raised both hands. We're business partners. Ansel is even my friend, how can I hurt them? The suffocating atmosphere dispersed a little, and Garin just looked at him guardedly. However, there was anticipation in his eyes which were what Mitchell needed for this deal. He turned to Dig and pointed at the cabinet with his head. Come drink, he asked, and naturally they didn't dare to risk getting poisoned. Why would I bother poisoning you in my own territory? Because you cannot kill us otherwise. Later. Well, they're not wrong. Mitchell sighed and took the cup handed to Garin, drinking from it himself. Delicious, it's your loss, such good tea from Ms. Althea. Sure enough, Garin flinched, and after a thought, he took the teapot and sipped on its contents. Silence passed by as Garin simmered in its taste, no doubt recalling certain memories. Soon, his stance softened, and he looked at Mitchell with less hostile eyes. Fine, how much? 2,000 gold. What? Logistics Officer Eagle gasped. Gil glared. Garin frowned. That's too much. He said, you did not pay that much of a penalty. Mitchell did not say anything in response. 2,000 gold in Xeno was indeed an overquote. However, his family lost much more than money. For example, reputation. For example, his mental health. Garin looked at the smiling man's unchanging expression. The atmosphere stagnated for a while, before Garin finally heaved a sigh. Did he have a choice? He couldn't coerce people outside for information. Especially, they obviously lived well here, how could they betray their lord? Garen rubbed his temple. I only have 600 in my hands, he told him. This was true. The next dividend from Bart's mercenary team would arrive in a few weeks. Mitchell was actually surprised he had that much. It irked him a bit. But anyway, there was more than one part in this deal. Then, for the balance, I'll take 500 from Althea, and for the rest just help us clean up 1,000 monsters above level 5 around our territory, and we'll call it even. He said, the final kill will be my guards. Garen's handsome eyebrows furrowed. Discomfort in making his wife pay for something he owed aside. Killing 1,000 monster would take a while since there was no large mob, let alone they had to give the last hit to others, which would easily triple the time requirement. How could Garen stay longer when he already knew where his wife is? No matter what, he couldn't do it. What if she was hurt while he was ambling about? She must be missing him so much. How could he bear let her suffer more? Don't worry about your wife, Mitchell said, knowing his concerns. She's doing very well. Garen looked at him to see if he'd say anything else, but he was still just as cryptic. Manipulative bastard. As if unaware of his glare, Mitchell retained his smile and continued with his vague clues. Althea is extremely strong. Bright territory cannot compare. Gil and Eagle's eyes widened, while Garen remained stoic, but the way his eyes dilated was very telling. We got a lot of our resources from there. What you see here, the food, the prosperity, Althea's is much more advanced. Even the design of the custom house had been bought from there. Gil and Eagle looked at each other with their eyebrows arched, a bit in disbelief. They were really curious about this place. Before, it was just because of sister-in-law, but now they also want to see it for what it was. Gil even thought deeper. From the way the captain recognized the territory name, perhaps sister-in-law had a lot to do with it. That meant one major thing, that she was definitely doing well. Mitchell let his words brew for a while before continuing to speak. Your wife holds a huge pie in there. How could she not live well? He smiled again, quite confident that he had placed his cards and would get an even better deal. But when Mitchell thought Garen would try to get more information, he just saw him nodding with a stupid look on his face. He looked quite smug, as if saying, yes, my wife is the best. Tusk. Mitchell looked at the guy's dreamy expression and sneered at his old self for losing to this boring lovesick idiot. Heth, it seemed like he didn't want to know he had children then. After a moment of dazedness, Garen turned serious. 500 gold now, 500 gold I will pay in the future, and 500 monsters. He hoped to see her status in person as soon as possible. He also needed money to make sure he could give her some gifts when they met. Mitchell thought for a while and thought it was indeed fair, but he had the upper hand here. 500 gold owed, 600 monsters, 1/3 of which must be level 7 or above. Garen paused, thinking. After a moment, he nodded. Deal, he said, a bit helpless. As he was led to the village center for a contract, he could only sigh, looking out longingly to a direction. I'm sorry, wife, you'll have to wait a little longer. Althea village. Althea stared at the clear skies with a complex expression, her pretty finger rhythmically tapping on the varnished wooden table. The protection period was already over for more than a day, and nothing happened. It wasn't that she was complaining. After all, at the very least, they managed to get their much-needed respite, and the resources have been recovered to a certain degree. Actually, it had recovered much faster than anticipated. This was because when people woke up, the first thing most did was start the production of everything needed in wars. This included gathering resources, making sure that the territory didn't lack it when in need. She had also managed to make a few more bombs by this time, which was a miracle because she slept for nearly a whole day. That mob really took a toll on her health and spirit. So she was thankful that they had some rest. It was just that the unknown was just intrinsically uncomfortable. There were times that the wait was no less torturous than the actual problem, and this was one of those times. What she didn't know was that the site she chose to place Althea was in an area in a particularly difficult terrain to access. It was also amidst many other Terran territories that was much more accessible to mobs and were therefore attacked first. However, whether or not they knew, they would definitely prepare enough for it. She shook her head, studying the status of the base. When the territory was upgraded, not only were there new building types available, which she'd be deferring until the first enemy arrived, but also the conditions for upgrading the buildings were made visible. When the weapon store was upgraded to 2, it could create more varieties of E-weapons. At level 3, it would be able to create level D weapons, particularly the sword, the spear, the axe, and the bow and arrow. The cost, though, was 10 times as much as it was at level 2. She still upgraded it, of course. Although Brenda had also become a level C weapon maker, she was busy with innovations and didn't have time to supply the whole territory. Not to mention, she also had to create level C weapons, something that a level 3 weapons store could not make at this time. There was also the fact that her own factories could make level E and D weapons for a much lower cost and better quality. But if she had the money, who would say no to the automatic production of standard weapons? This was especially true for normal citizens who couldn't get a hold of the higher quality factory-made ones. As for the warehouse, it was indeed nearly filled, but it should still have several more days before she met the requirements for its upgrade. Judging by its constant production by virtue of basically unlimited resources care of her citizens, the warehouse should upgrade very soon. On the other hand, the upgrade condition for the training hall was for the successful completion of 1,000 fights against the strongest level 5 monster. She needed to upgrade this one because she'd be hiring guards soon. The current 10 rooms wouldn't be enough for everyone. Unfortunately, this upgrade would take longer than others. Very few people, including her, had actually dealt with this. They were definitely far from 1,000 fights against a level 5, not to mention the added requirement of actually having to win the fight. By estimate, they probably had less than 100 wins after all this time. However, she believed that after the previous mob, more people would have gotten much stronger and would thus be able to win against the strongest monster. She looked at the population list on her Lord panel, and she made a rough count on the high-level Terrans in the territory. Level 8, 1. Level 6, 12. Level 5, 280. Level 4, 778. She reckoned this was a pretty good ratio. If everyone level 5 and above could fight and win a few times, then she'd meet the conditions. She ruminated for a bit, composing another announcement in her head. And so, after a while, a series of announcements echoed across the territory. The protection period is over. The average level of monsters outside has tripled. It is forbidden to leave the territory with teams of less than 10 people. The minimum level of leaving the walls is level 4, unless the average level of the entire party is level 8. Territory announcement. Now hiring guards. Requirements: minimum level 4, with cumulative contribution points of 500 on record. Good moral character. Wage: 100 copper day, 50 contribution points, 3 meals and accommodation included. Available slots: 0200. Training hall is 50% off for 3 days. Territory announcements. All guards that defeat the current highest level monster 10 times in the training hall will become a captain, without exception. Validity indefinite. Contribution point rankings will show the top 100 residents in terms of contribution points, can be set anonymous. Note will now be visible via the village center, in the same tab as personal contribution points. Minimum level was level 4, darn it. They're hiring 200. There's still one more day. I'm at the peak of level 3, I can do this. People who can beat the level 5 monster in the training hall 10 times will automatically be captains. I heard their salaries are 2 silver a day. PPFFFF, you say, so like you could beat the level 3 one. You shut up, the man yelled, don't jinx me. The other just laughed, though he, too, would definitely try out as well. There were also milder but no less meaningful reactions to the announcements. For instance, Cassie's. Cassie was still with her grandma, though they were not gathering resources as they usually would at this time. They were both sewing hems on face towels with many other women under Letty's store. During the last war, these sold out quickly. Not only were they used as face towels, but also for other things like cleaning wounds and stopping bleeding. After all, the number of medical gauze and medicines were limited, especially with their growing population. Her grandmother smiled. Well, they're hiring again. Cassie nodded. It's a good thing I reached level 4 during the last beast tide. The women turned to her, looking at her in interest. "You're trying out, Cassie," one woman said, and another nodded. "Oh yes, I heard you joined the Olympics before. You must be very good. We need more women fighting out there," one said, and another nodded very excitedly. "I'll make you good handkerchiefs and towels to use comfortably." Cassie blushed at the burst of attention and smiled shyly. "Thank you for your support," she said, her heart lit up a bit more with the fervent support of her friends. Her grip on the cloth tightened a bit before she resumed her job. The guardship could come later, the other jobs were no less important. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like the video and comment down if anything wrong in the story.